Hello again guys, and welcome to another screencast on the Sport and Society aspect of OCR A-Level PE. And for this particular screencast we're going to be discussing the idea of globalisation in sport in relation to the 21st century. As we've covered in the last few screencasts, it's important to remember your social cultural factors in relation to all of these different aspects. And again, if you need any support with that, please go back to the previous screencast on sport and society. So let's talk about this idea of globalisation of sport. This is a concept that has arisen from the financial world in the 1960s, and it's essentially a process that involves sport as a worldwide business. So that's your definition of globalisation, and you'll need that for your notes. It's this idea of, we've got this aspect in terms of sport. How can we make a profit off sport? How can we make a business model from sport, which is a popular thing in society that people like to do, play sport. So they're looking at a business model approach to sport. How this has been done is by the introduction of things such as corporate brands. So you see some on the screen, so Nike, Puma, Reebok, Adidas, etc. The introduction of media coverage, and more media coverage means we can get this sport across to lots of different people, and the idea of selling something to people. Performers can now freely move, as well as spectators, around different countries, and therefore we can advertise products to a range of cultures, as well as different countries, as well as our own country. And so that is an opportunity to make money from sport, as well as spectators and officials can also move and transfer. Globalisation has had its problems recently, and before we kick off with the factors that affect globalisation, it's important to understand some of these issues. So if you're looking to develop an idea of business and sport together, you're obviously going to develop your company that's going to expand as this globalisation process emerges, and therefore the governing body might need to adapt and expand to cover different remits and issues to do with globalisation. What this means is the governing bodies and the organisers of sport need to raise their media profile to gain much more public interest, and also to try and keep a lid on the branding that's going on in terms of specific brands associated with sports, etc. They might access things like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and social media accounts in order to generate more public interest in their particular sport. So the governing body is also doing this. They're promoting sport this way. The problem that has occurred recently to do with that is that these big national governing body institutions that are supposed to be controlling the sport fairly and ethically have had aspects of corruption and cheating involved with these particular governing bodies. So for example, Sepp Blatter and FIFA, massive corruption scandal, taking money and bribes in order to distribute the rights of a World Cup to a country. Similarly, you had the Sebastian Coe and Olympic sort of issues that have happened of late to do with the drug scandals, to do with Russia. And all of these things are associated because the governing body has now become a larger thing in society. They're a larger social media presence, and so therefore they need to be seen as being fair and ethical, and if they're not, they are scrutinised. So there is that issue with globalisation and making a brand and making more money out of things, but on the flip side, you've got to do it ethically, you've got to do it very clean and very fairly, because more people are paying attention to what's going on. Okay, so the main things for your exam are what we call the factors of globalisation. And remember, we're talking about the 21st century still, so all this comes under 21st century sport. We have these three factors that are important to developing globalisation and developing sport as a business. And they are freedom of movement, greater exposure of people to sport, and the increased media coverage. And if you work on each of those three factors, the idea of globalisation and selling products and selling brands and connecting with sport can all be accelerated. So let's look at the first factor, freedom of movement. When we talk about freedom of movement in sport, we talk about participants, so players. They are now freely able to move around countries or continents in the 21st century. Spectators, people can go and freely watch different events and world events in the 21st century. And of course, officials need to be able to travel and move and work alongside these events and national governing bodies to officiate certain sports. The EU Freedom of Movement Act has accelerated this. What that has meant is that if you are part of the EU Union, you could therefore work and apply your trade in any country of an EU member state. So for example, someone from Belgium is playing a high standard of cricket professionally. In theory, because they're part of the EU, they could come to Britain and play cricket professionally in Britain without any questions asked. It's a sort of international zone of movement, if you like. What that has meant is that players in clubs within the EU, as well as players worldwide, can now showcase their abilities to the highest bidder. And it means you can accelerate your worth. Added to this, new technology in this century, such as YouTube and the internet acceleration, means you could advertise your ability on YouTube to a club in a different country and they could put a bid in for you. So you could gain more money or accelerate your professional wages by attracting yourself to other clubs in different countries. The freedom of movement aspect of globalisation has also meant two other things. Firstly, athletes can now change countries. For example, Chris Froome, born in South Africa, represents Great Britain for cycling because he's easily able to get on a plane and move his family and commitments to England or Great Britain and therefore represent that country in that aspect of sport. A football player such as Gareth Bale, playing for Tottenham Hotspur, could now freely move to Real Madrid for an extortionate amount of money and earn and command higher wages. So what you end up with is more and more players transferring over to better clubs for more wages, for more money. So it's the idea of football and sport in itself becoming much more businesslike. You can clearly see on this slide, talking about that last aspect of freedom of football players moving around, that in the key here in the bottom left, if you have a look on the British Isles map, in 1989 to 90, the percentage or the where people were born and therefore played their football, marked in red, is much higher in 1989-90, that they were UK born, playing in the top flight of English football, they'd come from Britain. So what that means is essentially that most footballers in 1989-90 were from English or Scottish or Irish or Welsh nationality, and they were therefore playing for a football club at professional level. If you flash forward to the bigger picture of the world map, what the bigger picture then says is that Premier League footballers nowadays are now coming from everywhere, all aspects of the globe. You've got players who are coming from Australasia, so Australia or New Zealand. You've got players coming from mainland Europe. You've got players coming from Africa. You've got players coming from South America. So because of this Freedom of Movement Act, more foreign players have now entered the British game in terms of playing football. And so Premier League clubs are filled more with athletes from around the world as opposed to in 1989-90 when they were just British-based athletes. So that has changed in that sport. Factor 2 is what we call the greater exposure of people to sport. So if we want to grow business in terms of the globalisation process, we want as many people to watch sport as possible. we're going to make more money by doing that. Over this century, this has occurred through cheaper budget airlines. That means it's far easier for people to go and spectate games as well as for teams to travel. And if we can get more spectators going to events, more people are going to see our brands, we're going to make more money off the globalisation process. That has meant a massive increase of people being able to watch sport through cheaper airfares. Once they understand that a sport they want to watch may be abroad or in a different country, the clubs have been very clever with this in terms of their branding and globalisation patterns. Football clubs, American football clubs, NFL clubs, NBA clubs start to develop what's called global tours and competitions. So there might be an off-season and they'll fly to Singapore and they'll play some fixtures in Singapore, and this will reach their target audience of more Singaporean spectators. That means more money for the club. That's globalisation. Technology has developed massively in this century. You can now watch fixtures and games on your mobile phone. And sports companies and sports clubs have switched on to this because they've offered the opportunity for the fan to pay a certain amount a month to watch live games. Good examples of this are LFC TV, Liverpool Football Club. They have an app called a Go System, and you can watch live games for a subscription amount. NFL American football teams have what's called a Game Pass. NBA, National Basketball Association in America, also do the same thing. So they're making an awful lot of money by not even you being in this country. But they're giving access and exposure of people to their sport. So you become interested, so you buy something. And it leads to massive financial incentives for clubs if they can get this process going. The final factor, of course, is the massive change in media over this century compared to the previous century. Now, in the previous century, you had to listen to sports fixtures on the radio. Eventually, when television was developed for the British public, sort of 50s, 60s, early 70s, as it developed into colour, we had more football fixtures being provided at that point in time, but it was limited. You had a limited amount to watch. By the end of that century, you have the development of the internet, but the internet was very slow at that point in time. This new century, 21st century, we have things like 5G internet, we have fibre optic cable, broadband, so these things are rapidly accelerating. We've now got Freeview channels, so BBC, ITV, Channel 4. So mainstream terrestrial channels, we can watch sport on these channels compared to the previous century. You've also got satellite channels, so Sky, Virgin, BT will provide a paid subscription to watch sport live. We can access more sport this way. So compared to last century, the media has now a big influence because we can watch so much sport if we want to. Previous century, we had some radio channels, but they weren't sport related as such. We've now got things like Talk Sport, BBC Radio 5 Live, so we can listen to live games if we want to, both digitally and on an analogue radio. That's changed, so we're accessing sport this way. You've got regular sports columns in newspapers, as well as big pull-out sections of sports fixtures and commentary, so we can access sport in that direction. There are also sport-specific magazines, which had started in the back end of the 20th century, but have developed further into digital magazines this century. Added to that, young people these days might access their sports feed through Facebook, Twitter or YouTube, so you have apps that also do this. So all of this has added up to a greater number of people watching or participating or getting interested in sport, which means there's an opportunity to sell things and brand things to people who are accessing these platforms. Again, this is the concept of globalisation. we have what's called, in this relationship between media, sponsorship and sport, something called the Golden Triangle. And this means that sport, media and sponsorship are interdependent on each other. That's the definition of the Golden Triangle. For example, if we place something on television in relation to sport, it could be this attracts a sponsor or some sort of sponsorship deal because it's been placed on television. So the sponsor weighs in with quite a lot of money to place this product. That money might not only be shared in the media in terms of accelerating their media production, but it will also be shared with the sport itself. So the sponsorship funds, some of that access might go to the sport. The sport itself, because it's then on the media, in terms of television, might gain more promotion, and so more people might participate in it. And because more people participate in it, it then means that we're then likely to want it back on television again. So it's this growing cycle that just keeps going round. And the more a sport becomes popular with the public, the more sponsors that will be interested in sponsoring it, the more it gets televised, the more people see it, participation increases. So it's a constant cycle. Here's a good example of that in the late 1990s. So Sky Television introduced this idea of the Premier League. Before the Premier League, there were 4 divisions in English football. The first division, the second division, third division, fourth division, and that's the way it always was. And fixtures, you might get 1 game a week that will be on the television. There might be a highlights programme on a Saturday evening. Mainly the games that were on the television were cup games. Sky changed this because in 1992 they decided they want to break away from everything and place and design a new league that was only going to be shown live on satellite television. And they paid £304 million to do this, which was an extraordinary amount of money at the time. This meant that all the old First Division clubs decided to go and join Sky's new league, and they created something called the Premier League. All the Premier League games were only on Sky Television, so people had to pay for a satellite dish or Sky subscription to watch all of the Premier League games. So it was a very exclusive thing. You couldn't then watch it on terrestrial TV. Because this idea of placing sport on the media, as what we just said about the Golden Triangle, had occurred, Carling then wanted to become involved in this. Carling saw an opportunity to sponsor the Premier League. So we're starting this Golden Triangle route. So we've put sport on the media. The sponsorship has come along and paid a lot of money and called it the Carling Premiership. Very clever logo of theirs. And by pumping a load of money from Carling into the Premier League, that meant the sport itself started to grow rapidly. We had more money for grassroots sport because suddenly £304 million has been put in to this Premier League, plus the sponsorship money. So participation of football increased. Therefore, people wanted to watch more football. And so Sky then put more football on television for their subscribers. So it's this constant idea that sport, sponsorship and the media are interlinked. And that's a very important concept to understand. You've got problems with this aspect of the media though, and we spoke about this in the last screencast, but women are still on the margins of sport. They're not quite there. It's increased, and we talked about team sports increasing last screencast, and popularity of this in terms of spectatorism is slowly increasing. And what is starting to happen now is the Golden Triangle effect in its early days are starting to occur for female sport. So the BBC are presently putting on a lot more women's football. More people are becoming interested in it. Slowly and slowly sponsors will become attracted and it will increase in popularity. But at present, in this 21st century, it's not to the level that males are. Ethnic minorities are still underrepresented in sports media, so presenters, as we spoke about last time, but also generally across all sports in terms of reporting or breaking through as commentators. So we need more of those things to occur so they are seen on the media. In terms of Asian representation, that's very lacking across all sports, especially in football, which is our national sport. And again, on sports media, there doesn't seem to be many Asian commentators or presenters. So it's lacking. Disabled athletes have seen a little bit of a surge during the Paralympics of London 2012. A lot has been placed on Channel 4 to promote this idea of the superhumans, as they like to call it. But since that point in time, there's still not fair representation of disabled athletes, and they're really underrepresented in the sports media in terms of presenters again and commentators. So they're not seen enough on the media, and this doesn't allow fair access for those groups in society. The other issues you've got with the media and promoting sport on the media is that changes have occurred because the media are now in control of certain aspects of sport. For example, because the Olympics is now a big global business, so this idea of globalisation, taking it around the world, sending it on different TV platforms so people can see it. The problem with that is a good example in Rio is that meant all the live sports that were shown were really unsuitable hours for the British public. And so people might not tune in because the diving was at something like 2 or 3 in the morning. And so the British public are asleep. So there's a clash of scheduling or clash of timing, which meant people couldn't see it. Broadcasters such as BT Sport and Sky have also changed the schedules of games in different sports. Rugby league has been changed to a summer season. Football fixtures are now played not on a Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock anymore, they're on Monday nights. They're in midweek games. There are numerous days where they play these games. It's not a regular standard thing anymore. And so they're in control of these aspects. And that can be quite confusing for some members of the public who just want to spectate their sport or they just want to watch, but they have a different day where they have to watch certain games. You've also got the advent of different technology in the sport itself. So you have the third umpire for cricket. You've got Hawkeye for tennis. You've got VAR for football. And what these things do, they're designed to increase the fairness of those sports. But essentially, what they tend to do is slow the game down. And so when the spectator is watching games, it really slows the action down. They feel frustrated about that. And this has all come about because of the idea of the viewer needs to see the game, the viewer needs to see what's going on, we want to give the viewers as much access as possible. So this idea of promoting sport in the media to gain more money has also got some negative effects here. Okay, once again, thanks for watching. As always, if you need any more help with sport and society or any other topic on the OCR A-Level PE syllabus, please head to the iSpeakpe channel on YouTube.